Bullies pants the new teacher. Big mistake. She was an ex-Marine. The first day Riley Torres walked into Oakmont Ridge High School, she looked nothing like what anyone expected. She was barely taller than some of the students, with a slight frame that seemed almost fragile in her carefully pressed blazer and simple flats. Her dark hair was pulled back in a modest ponytail, and she carried herself with an unassuming quietness that made her blend into the beige walls of the administrative hallway. The other teachers barely glanced at her as she signed in at the main office, collecting her staff badge and a folder of orientation materials. The secretary, a tired woman named Mrs. Pemberton, who'd worked there for 23 years, gave her a sympathetic smile that said she'd seen dozens of young teachers come and go. Riley had taken the position teaching English and composition at the last minute, filling a vacancy left by a teacher who'd quit mid-semester after what the principal vaguely described as classroom management issues. It was November, cold enough that students wore hoodies and jackets into the building, tracking in dead leaves and the smell of cigarette smoke from the parking lot. Oakmont Ridge sat on the edge of a sprawling suburb outside Pittsburgh, the kind of place where factories had closed down decades ago and families either scraped by or moved away. The school itself was a patchwork of additions built over 50 years, the original brick building with its crumbling steps, a newer science wing with flickering fluorescent lights, a gymnasium that smelled perpetually of old sweat and floor wax, and temporary trailers that housed overflow classrooms. The student body was restless, divided sharply between kids who played sports and expected to leave town on scholarships, those who worked part-time jobs and showed up exhausted, and a smaller group who seemed to exist solely to make life difficult for everyone else. Riley had read the staff handbook on the long bus ride from her tiny apartment downtown. She'd noticed the disciplinary statistics, the chronic absenteeism rates, the notes about gang activity in the surrounding neighborhoods. She knew what she was walking into. Her classroom was on the second floor of the main building, room 214, overlooking the parking lot and the football field beyond. Someone had left it in disarray, desks shoved against walls, old papers scattered on the floor, motivational posters hanging crooked or torn down entirely. She spent her first morning alone, rearranging the space, scrubbing marker stains off the whiteboard, organizing the battered copies of required reading texts. Through the window, she could see students arriving, clustering in groups by their cars, shoving each other, laughing too loud. The morning bell hadn't rung yet. She took a breath and tried to remember why she'd thought teaching was a good idea. Riley Torres was 31, though people usually guessed younger. She'd grown up in a military family, her father career Army, her mother a nurse who followed him from base to base. Riley herself had enlisted in the Marines right out of high school, driven by a need to prove herself and escape the suffocating expectations of a family that had never quite known what to do with a daughter who was too quiet, too thoughtful, too prone to disappearing into books. She'd served 2 tours overseas, seen things she didn't talk about, earned commendations she kept in a box under her bed. She'd learned discipline, patience, and how to survive in hostile environments. She'd also learned how to read people, how to stay calm under pressure, and how to move with efficiency when necessary. But after 8 years, she'd left. There were reasons she didn't share with anyone. Nightmares that made sleep impossible, a growing sense that violence was becoming too familiar, a moment during her second deployment when she'd realized she was starting to lose pieces of herself she'd never get back. She'd finished her bachelor's degree online while deployed, started a master's program in education when she got stateside, and decided that maybe she could do something meaningful in a different way. Teaching seemed like a place where discipline and patience might actually help people instead of harm them. She didn't tell anyone about her background. On her resume, she'd simply listed military service under previous employment. During her interview, Principal Carver, a broad-shouldered man who looked perpetually exhausted, had asked her a few perfunctory questions about classroom management and curriculum, then hired her on the spot. They were desperate, she could tell. The first bell rang at 7:45, a harsh electric buzz that echoed through the hallways. Riley stood at the front of her classroom, hands folded as students began filtering in. Third period junior English, 28 names on the roster, though she suspected not all of them would show up. The kids came in clusters, loud and chaotic, throwing backpacks onto desks, shouting across the room to friends, completely ignoring her presence at the front. She waited. Let them settle. Let them see her. A tall kid with a shaved head and a letter jacket came in last, moving with the swagger of someone who owned every room he entered. His name, she'd learn later, was Brendan Kovich, star linebacker, son of a local construction company owner, and the undisputed leader of a group that made teachers' lives miserable. He looked at Riley, then at his friends, and smirked. He dropped into a desk in the back corner, sprawling his legs out into the aisle. Riley introduced herself. Her voice was steady, quieter than the noise in the room, but clear. "Good morning. I'm Miss Torres. I'll be your English teacher for the rest of the semester." The room didn't quiet down. A girl near the front, Alyssa, according to the seating chart Riley was trying to match to faces, was texting under her desk. Two boys by the window were throwing wadded paper at each other. Brendan was whispering something to the guy next to him, a wiry kid with a mean smile named Tyler Rennick. They were laughing. She continued anyway, outlining the syllabus, explaining expectations, trying to establish some basic structure. Her teaching style was methodical, almost military in its precision, but she kept her tone conversational, trying to build rapport. A few students paid attention, a quiet girl named Emma in the front row, a lanky kid named Jordan who sat alone by the bookshelf. Most ignored her. When she tried to start the lesson on narrative structure, Brendan raised his hand. She called on him, hopeful. "Yeah, so question," he said, grinning. "How old are you? You look like you should be in high school with us." Laughter rippled through the room. Riley kept her expression neutral. "My age isn't relevant to the lesson, Brendan. Now, as I was saying..." "No, seriously," Tyler interrupted, leaning forward. "Are you even old enough to be a teacher? Did you, just graduate college last year?" More laughter. Riley felt the heat of their attention, the testing, the probing for weakness. This was expected. New teachers always got tested. She'd been briefed on this. Stay calm, redirect, don't engage emotionally. "Let's focus on the material," she said evenly. "I'd like everyone to open their books to..." "I bet she's like 22, someone said from the middle of the room. "She's probably younger than my sister," another voice added. Riley tried to push forward, but the class had slipped away from her. They weren't hostile exactly, just dismissive. She was an interruption in their day, a substitute teacher who'd somehow gotten hired permanently, someone to test and ultimately ignore. By the time the bell rang, she'd barely gotten through half of what she'd planned. The students filed out without a backward glance. The rest of the day followed the same pattern. Her other classes were variations on the theme. Some students cooperative, most apathetic, a handful openly contemptuous. The school operated on a weird energy, a constant low-level chaos that the administration seemed to have accepted as normal. Teachers stood in the hallways during passing periods, monitoring but not really intervening, looking worn down by years of small battles lost. Riley ate lunch alone in her classroom, a sandwich she'd brought from home. Through the window, she could see the cafeteria building across the courtyard, students spilling out onto the concrete patio to eat, clustering in their territorial groups. She recognized Brendan out there, surrounded by his crew, Tyler, a stocky kid named Cody Walsh, who wore a permanent scowl, a girl named Vanessa Park, who had the sharp-edged beauty of someone who knew exactly how much power it gave her, and a tall, quiet kid named Marcus Chen, who seemed to follow Brendan's lead without question. They were laughing, shoving each other, radiating the confidence of people who'd never been told no in any meaningful way. Over the following weeks, Riley settled into a routine. She arrived early, left late, and spent her evenings planning lessons that students mostly ignored. She tried different approaches, group work, discussions, hands-on activities, but nothing seemed to break through the wall of apathy. The administration was no help. Principal Carver's solution to every problem was a vague suggestion to build relationships with students, as if friendliness alone could overcome years of dysfunction. The other teachers were sympathetic but resigned. Mrs. Holloway, the math teacher across the hall, told her over coffee in the faculty lounge that Oakmont Ridge had a reputation for burning through new teachers. "If you make it to Christmas, you're doing better than most," she said with a tired smile. The bullying started small. Riley noticed it first in the little things, her classroom supplies disappearing, papers she'd left on her desk rearranged or crumpled, crude drawings left on the whiteboard after she'd stepped out for a moment. Messages appeared on the board in erasable marker. "Ms. Torres is a joke, and quit while you can." She erased them without comment, refusing to give whoever was doing it the satisfaction of a reaction. But Brendan and his group escalated. They started arriving late to class deliberately, making a show of it, interrupting whatever lesson was in progress. Brendan would saunter in 10 minutes after the bell, offer a lazy, "Sorry, Ms. Torres," that dripped with insincerity, and drop into his seat with exaggerated movements. Tyler would follow, laughing. The rest of the class would watch to see how she'd respond. She tried the official channels, detention slips, referrals to the office, parent phone calls. Nothing stuck. Brendan's father was a Booster Club donor and apparently untouchable. Tyler's mother worked in the district office. Vanessa's family had money and lawyers. Every disciplinary action she attempted got watered down or disappeared entirely. Principal Carver called her into his office after her third week and suggested, in a tone that was trying to be gentle, that maybe she needed to be more flexible with certain students. "Brendan's under a lot of pressure with football," he said. "Sometimes we need to give kids grace." Riley didn't argue. She'd learned in the military that you couldn't fight every battle, especially not against the institutional inertia of people who'd rather maintain a comfortable dysfunction than address real problems. But the message was clear. She was on her own. The cafeteria was the worst. Riley had lunch duty twice a week, which meant standing near the food lines and monitoring the chaos. The cafeteria at Oakmont Ridge was a cavernous space with too few windows, filled with long tables where students sat in rigid social hierarchies. Athletes near the center, popular kids nearby, everyone else pushed to the margins. The noise was overwhelming. Hundreds of conversations, trays clattering, the occasional shout or burst of laughter that cut through everything else. Brendan and his crew sat at a table near the trophy case, a position that let them watch everyone who came through the lunch line. Riley tried to stay near the periphery, visible but not intrusive, but they noticed her. Tyler started a game where he'd pretend to trip when walking past her, stumbling dramatically and nearly spilling his lunch, then apologizing profusely while his friends laughed. Vanessa would make loud comments just within earshot. God, imagine being a teacher and still having to eat cafeteria food. So sad. And then glance over to make sure Riley had heard. One afternoon in early December, Riley was standing near the back wall when she noticed a younger student, a slight kid with glasses who looked terrified, being cornered by two of Brendan's hangers-on. They were taking his lunch piece by piece, making him watch. Riley moved over quickly, her voice calm but firm. "That's enough. Give it back." The two kids looked at her like she was a mild inconvenience. One of them, a sophomore named Jake, shrugged. "We're just messing around, Ms. Torres." "Chill." "Give it back," she repeated. Her tone didn't change, but something in her posture did. She'd learned in the Marines how to carry yourself in a way that suggested you weren't someone to test. It usually worked. Jake rolled his eyes, but handed the lunch back. They walked away, muttering. The kid with glasses mumbled a thank you and disappeared. Riley thought that would be the end of it. But later that day, she found her car in the parking lot with all 4 tires slashed. The school's security cameras conveniently didn't cover that section of the lot. Principal Carver sighed when she reported it, promised to look into it, and did nothing. Riley paid for new tires out of her own pocket and said nothing to anyone. At home, she lived in a 3rd-floor walk-up in a neighborhood that was trying hard to gentrify, but hadn't quite made it. Her apartment was small, sparsely furnished, a futon that served as both couch and bed, a tiny kitchen table, bookshelves she'd built herself from cinder blocks and planks. She didn't own a TV. In the evenings, she cooked simple meals, ran through bodyweight exercises in her living room, and read. She was working through a stack of novels she'd never had time for during her service. Steinbeck, Morrison, McCarthy. She'd underline passages that struck her, make notes in the margins. Teaching had seemed like it might be a way to share those moments of connection with books, those flashes of understanding that made the world make sense. But her students didn't care about Steinbeck. They barely cared about anything. She didn't have many friends. Her military buddies were scattered across the country, and she'd lost touch with most of them. There was a woman named Clara who lived downstairs, a nurse who worked nights, and they'd occasionally share coffee on the building's back steps. But it wasn't a deep friendship. Mostly, Riley was alone, which was fine. She'd always been comfortable with solitude. But the isolation at school was different. It was hostile. She felt it in the way students looked through her, the way other teachers offered sympathy but no real solidarity, the way the building itself seemed designed to wear people down, its flickering lights, its broken heating system that left some rooms freezing and others sweltering, its pervasive smell of industrial cleaner and desperation. The incidents continued. Someone put glue on her desk chair. She nearly sat in it before she noticed. Crude notes started appearing in her mailbox in the faculty lounge. Once, she found a dead rat in her desk drawer, carefully placed so she'd find it when reaching for her grading pen. She disposed of it without flinching. She'd seen worse overseas, but the message was clear. They wanted her gone. She tried to focus on the few students who seemed genuinely interested in learning. Emma, the quiet girl in the front row, wrote thoughtful essays and stayed after class sometimes to ask questions about the reading. Jordan, the lanky kid by the bookshelf, had a sharp mind and a dark sense of humor that came through in his writing. There was a girl named Priya in her 5th period class who wanted to be a journalist and asked Riley for book recommendations. These small connections were what kept her coming back. But Brendan's group was relentless. They'd started a game in class where they'd pass notes back and forth, deliberately obvious about it, waiting for her to confiscate them. When she did, the notes were always innocuous. Homework answers, lunch plans. Nothing she could discipline them for. It was just another way to waste her time, to show they didn't respect her authority. In the locker hallway between classes, she'd hear them whispering as she passed. Tyler and Cody would make exaggerated bowing gestures, mockingly formal. "Good morning, Ms. Torres," Tyler would say in a high-pitched voice. Cody would respond in the same tone. "Oh, Ms. Torres, you're such an inspiration." They'd dissolve into laughter as she walked by. She never responded. She'd learned in the military that the best way to deal with people trying to provoke you was to give them nothing. No anger, no hurt, no visible reaction. Just steady, impassive calm. But inside, something was building. Not anger exactly. She'd been trained to control that. but a cold awareness that this situation couldn't continue indefinitely. December brought snow, heavy and grey, blanketing the parking lot and making the morning commute treacherous. Riley took the bus now, unable to trust that her car wouldn't be vandalized again. She'd arrive at school in the dark, the building lit up like a tired beacon, and make her way through the slushy parking lot to the staff entrance. The custodian, an older man named Frank, who actually talked to her sometimes, would nod good morning. He'd told her once that he'd seen a lot of teachers come through Oakmont Ridge. The ones who make it are the ones who don't take it personally, he'd said. She'd thought about that a lot. The breaking point came 2 days before winter break. It was during lunch duty. Riley was standing near the windows, watching the cafeteria with the blank attentiveness she'd perfected in the Marines, aware of everything, visibly engaged with nothing. The room was loud with the pre-vacation energy, students hyped up on sugar and the promise of 2 weeks away from school. Brendan's table was particularly rowdy. They were throwing food, balancing spoons on their noses, recording each other on their phones for social media. Standard obnoxious behavior, but nothing she needed to intervene on yet. Then Tyler stood up holding his phone and started filming in Riley's direction. She noticed but didn't react, just continued her slow patrol along the windows. She heard him say something to Brendan, both of them laughing. Vanessa joined in, her voice cutting through the cafeteria noise. "Oh my God, do it. That would be hilarious." Riley felt the shift in energy before she understood what was happening. The students near Brendan's table were turning to watch something. She saw Brendan stand up, that familiar smirk on his face, walking toward her with exaggerated casualness. Tyler was still filming. Other students were pulling out their phones now too. Brendan stopped a few feet from her, surrounded by his crew. "Hey, Ms. Torres," he said, loud enough that nearby tables could hear. "Got a question about the homework?" She turned to face him, her expression neutral. "What's your question, Brendan?" He grinned wider. "Actually, I was wondering, do teachers even wear real clothes under those boring outfits? Like, do you own jeans, or are you stuck in permanent substitute teacher mode?" His friends laughed. Riley kept her face blank. "If you have a real question about class, we can discuss it after lunch. Otherwise, sit down." "That's not very friendly, Ms. Torres," Tyler said, moving closer with his phone. He was recording everything. "We're just trying to get to know you better." She could feel the situation escalating, that familiar prickle of awareness she used to get before things went sideways on patrol. Multiple threats, confined space, audience watching. Her training kicked in automatically. Assess, de-escalate, prepare. "Everyone sit down," she said, her voice calm but carrying. "Lunch is almost over." Brendan stepped closer, invading her space. He was taller than her by several inches, using his size deliberately. "You know what your problem is, Ms. Torres? You're too uptight. You need to relax. Have some fun." And then, before she could process what was happening, Cody came up behind her. She felt his hands grab the waistband of her slacks and yank down hard. Everything slowed down in that moment. She felt the fabric slide down her hips, the sudden exposure, the cool air on her skin. She heard the eruption of laughter, shocked and delighted, spreading through the cafeteria like wildfire. Phones were out everywhere now, recording, flashing. Tyler was right in front of her, capturing everything. Riley's mind went completely cold and clear, the way it used to in combat. No emotion, just pure, tactical awareness. She grabbed her slacks with one hand, pulling them up in a single smooth motion, her other hand shooting out to snatch Tyler's phone from his grip before he could react. The whole movement took less than 2 seconds. She shoved the phone in her blazer pocket and turned to face Brendan, who was laughing so hard he was nearly doubled over. "That's assault," she said quietly. Her voice was different now, stripped of the gentle teacher tone she'd been using for weeks. It was the voice she'd used to give orders to Marines under fire. Flat, cold, absolutely controlled. "All of you, principal's office. Now." But they just laughed harder. Vanessa was recording on her phone now too. "Oh my God, that was amazing. Did you see her face? The cafeteria was in chaos. Some students were laughing, others looked shocked or uncomfortable. The other lunch duty teacher, Mr. Harrison from the science department, was pushing through the crowd, but he'd been on the other side of the room and hadn't seen what happened. Riley could feel something inside her cracking, years of discipline straining against the urge to respond the way she'd been trained to respond to threats. But these weren't enemy combatants. They were students. Kids. Stupid, cruel kids. But still kids. She walked out of the cafeteria with as much dignity as she could manage, her slacks properly in place, her face carefully blank. She could hear the laughter following her down the hallway. She went straight to the principal's office. Principal Carver listened to her report with an expression that cycled between uncomfortable, skeptical, and resigned. "That's a serious accusation, Ms. Torres," he said when she finished. "Physical assault. Do you have any witnesses who can corroborate what happened?" "The entire cafeteria saw it," she said, "and at least a dozen students recorded it on their phones." Carver sighed. "I'll talk to the students involved. But Ms. Torres, between you and me, sometimes boys that age, they pull pranks. It's not appropriate, but I'm not sure it rises to the level of assault." Riley stared at him. "A student pulled down my clothing in front of hundreds of people. That's not a prank, Principal Carver. That's a crime." He shifted uncomfortably. "I understand you're upset, and you have every right to be. But we need to be careful about how we handle this. Brendan comes from a prominent family. His father is already unhappy about some of the disciplinary actions we've attempted this semester. If we go too far, there could be legal implications for the school." "Legal implications," Riley repeated slowly. She could feel that cold clarity spreading through her entire body now, the same feeling she'd had when she'd finally decided to leave the military because she couldn't stomach the moral compromises anymore. "So you're saying that because his father has money and influence, he can assault a teacher without consequences?" "I'm not saying that," Carver said quickly. "I'm saying we need to handle this carefully. I'll talk to the students. There will be consequences. But we need to be proportional." Riley stood up. "I'm going home for the day. I'll be back after the break." She left before he could respond. She walked out of the building, through the parking lot, where students were starting to load onto buses, and kept walking until she reached the bus stop 3 blocks away. She sat on the cold metal bench and waited, her hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. She'd kept it together. She'd maintained control. But something fundamental had broken, and she knew she couldn't go back to the way things had been. That night, alone in her apartment, Riley didn't cry. She'd learned a long time ago that crying didn't solve problems. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table and thought systematically about her options. She could quit, walk away, find another school, start over somewhere else. That was probably the smart move. Oakmont Ridge was toxic, and it wasn't going to change. But quitting felt like surrender. And Riley Torres didn't surrender. She'd been through hell overseas, had faced down situations that made a high school cafeteria look like a playground. She'd survived worse than some teenage bullies. The problem was that she'd been approaching this wrong. She'd been trying to be the teacher they expected, soft, accommodating, willing to absorb abuse in the name of building relationships. That version of herself wasn't working. She thought about her time in the Marines, the training, the discipline, the way you earned respect by proving you could handle whatever got thrown at you. She thought about her drill instructor, a woman named Sergeant Ramirez, who'd been 5 feet tall and terrifying, who taught Riley that physical size didn't matter if you had absolute confidence in your capabilities. She thought about the moment in basic training when a male recruit twice her size had tried to intimidate her during a sparring exercise, and she'd put him on his back in 3 moves. The shocked silence that followed, the respect that came after. Maybe that was what Oakmont Ridge needed. Not a gentle teacher trying to win them over with lesson plans and patience. Maybe they needed to see what she actually was. The next morning, Riley didn't go to school. It was the last day before break, mostly a throwaway day of movies and parties. She spent the day at a gym downtown, a no-frills place that catered to serious athletes and former military. She'd kept up her training over the years, but sporadically, fitting in workouts when she had time. Now she talked to the owner, a former Army Ranger named Dave, who remembered her from when she'd first moved to the city. She explained what she needed. He understood immediately. "You need to get your head back in the game," he said. "You've gone soft." It was true. She'd let teaching consume her, had let the daily grind wear down her edges. She'd forgotten what it felt like to be sharp, ready, capable of handling threats. Dave set her up with a training schedule, 6 days a week, 2 hours minimum, focusing on the skills she'd let atrophy. Striking, grappling, conditioning. Not gym training for fitness, but combat training for reality. "You're not going to fight a bunch of high school kids," Dave said flatly when she explained the situation. "But you're going to carry yourself like someone who could." Big difference. Riley spent the winter break transforming herself. Every morning she was at the gym by 5:30, running through drills until her body remembered what it used to know. Dave worked with her, not going easy just because she was a teacher now. He pushed her the way Sergeant Ramirez had pushed her, until she was too tired to think, until the movements became automatic again. Kick, block, strike, move. Control the distance, read the threat, stay calm under pressure. In the afternoons, she ran through the snowy streets of her neighborhood, building back the cardiovascular endurance she'd lost. In the evenings, she did bodyweight exercises in her apartment until her muscles screamed. She didn't think about Brendan or Tyler or the humiliation in the cafeteria. She just worked. She also started seeing a therapist, a woman named Dr. Yates, who specialized in working with veterans. Riley had resisted therapy for years, seeing it as weakness, but she was starting to understand that you couldn't fix everything with physical training. Dr. Yates helped her process the anger she'd been suppressing, the sense of powerlessness that had been eating at her since she'd started teaching. They talked about boundaries, about the difference between letting go and giving up, about how to exist in a civilian world that didn't always make sense after military service. "You're not in combat anymore," Dr. Yates told her during one session. "But your nervous system doesn't know that. It's still responding to threats the way it was trained to. You need to find a way to recalibrate." Riley practiced meditation, breathing exercises, visualization techniques. Not the soft, New Age kind, but tactical, mental preparation. She visualized walking through the school hallways with confidence. She visualized responding to provocation with calm control. She visualized the moment when Brendan and his crew would test her again, because they would, and how she'd handle it without losing control. By the time school started up again in January, Riley Torres was a different person. Physically, the change was subtle but noticeable. She'd always been in decent shape, but now she moved with a precision and confidence that hadn't been there before. She'd cut her hair shorter, a practical style that stayed out of her face. She'd bought new clothes, still professional but different. Fitted black slacks, simple tops, a leather jacket for the walk from the bus stop. She looked like someone who could handle herself. More importantly, she felt different. The constant low-level anxiety that had characterized her first months at Oakmont Ridge was gone, replaced by a calm certainty. She knew who she was again. She'd spent too long trying to be someone else, trying to fit into a role that didn't suit her. Now, She was done pretending. Her first day back, Riley arrived at school early as always. The building was quiet, just custodians and a few teachers catching up on grading. She went to her classroom and rearranged it again, pushing desks into a U shape that would let her see every student at once, removing the clutter from her desk, clearing the walls of the half-hearted decorations she'd put up in November. The room looked sparse now, almost military in its efficiency. Good. When students started arriving for third period, she could feel them noticing the change. The classroom was different. She was different. She stood at the front, arms crossed, watching them file in with an alertness that made some of them uncomfortable. Brendan came in with his usual swagger, but even he seemed to sense something had shifted. He dropped into his back corner desk, but he was watching her carefully. Riley waited for the bell, then closed the door with a decisive click. She didn't smile. She didn't do the welcoming teacher routine. "Welcome back," she said. Her voice was controlled, carrying easily across the room. "Before we start the new semester, we're going to establish some ground rules. Things are going to work differently from now on." The room was quiet. Students were actually paying attention, maybe just out of curiosity about what had changed. "First rule, when you enter this classroom, you're here to learn. Not to socialize, not to mess around, not to test boundaries. You're here to learn. If you can't handle that, you can leave now and take it up with administration." She paused, making eye contact with different students around the room. When her gaze landed on Brendan, he held it for a moment, then looked away. "Second rule, respect is non-negotiable. You don't have to like me, you don't have to like English class, but you will conduct yourselves with basic human decency, or you will deal with consequences that don't involve a phone call to your parents." Tyler raised his hand, that familiar smirk on his face. "What kind of consequences?" Riley looked at him without expression. "Try me and find out." Something in her tone made him shut his mouth. She continued outlining expectations. No phones, no side conversations, assignments turned in on time, participation required. It wasn't harsh exactly, but it was firm in a way she hadn't been before. She sounded like someone who wouldn't bend, wouldn't negotiate, wouldn't tolerate the chaos they'd created in the fall semester. When she started the actual lesson, they were beginning a unit on the Odyssey. She taught differently too. No more trying to make it fun or relevant. She just taught it straight, explaining the hero's journey, the concept of transformation through suffering, the idea that who you are when things are easy doesn't matter as much as who you are when everything falls apart. Some students tuned out, but more paid attention than had the entire previous semester. Emma in the front row was taking notes furiously. Jordan by the bookshelf was actually engaged. Even a few of Brendan's group looked marginally interested. The period ended without incident. As students filed out, Riley noticed them talking in quieter voices than usual. She'd gotten their attention, at least temporarily. Now she just had to hold it. The rest of the day followed the same pattern. Her other classes noticed the change too. Fifth period, where Priya, the aspiring journalist, sat, felt almost energized. Students who'd been drifting through the semester suddenly had structure to push against or work within. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. But Riley knew the real test would come in the hallways, the cafeteria, the unstructured spaces where students could push back without consequence. She made a point of being visible, standing in the locker hallway during passing periods, walking through the cafeteria during lunch, showing up at the parking lot before and after school. She didn't engage with students unless they approached her, but she was there, a constant presence that said she wasn't going anywhere. 3 days into the new semester, Brendan made his move. Riley was in the second-floor hallway after school, on her way to the office to make copies, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Brendan, Tyler, and Cody approaching. The hallway was mostly empty. Most students had already left, and teachers were in their rooms or meetings. They'd chosen the moment deliberately. "Hey, Ms. Torres," Brendan said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "We wanted to talk to you about something." Riley stopped, turning to face them fully. She set her bag down slowly, giving herself room to move if she needed to. "What is it?" Tyler stepped closer, invading her space the way Brendan had in the cafeteria. "We heard you were saying stuff about us. About what happened before break. That's not cool." She didn't move back. She stood her ground, meeting his eyes steadily. "I reported an incident to administration." "That's not saying stuff, that's following procedure." "Yeah, but nothing happened to us," Cody added, moving to her other side. "They were trying to surround her, box her in. Basic intimidation tactics. She'd seen it 100 times. So maybe you should just let it go." Riley could feel the old training kicking in, her body automatically shifting into a balanced stance, her awareness expanding to track all three of them at once. She kept her voice level. "I'm not interested in having this conversation with you. If you have concerns, talk to Principal Carver." "We're talking to you," Brendan said. He was directly in front of her now, close enough that she could smell his cologne. "Because we want to make sure there's no hard feelings. We were just messing around. You get that, right? It was a test. They wanted to see if she'd fold, if she'd accept their non-apology, if she'd go back to being the pushover teacher they thought she was." Riley took a breath, staying calm. "Back up," she said quietly. "All of you, now." There was a moment of electric tension. Tyler laughed, but it sounded forced. "Or what?" Riley didn't answer. She just looked at him with the kind of steady, measuring gaze she'd used with hostile civilians in checkpoints overseas. The look that said she'd assessed the threat and wasn't impressed. The look that said she could handle whatever came next. It worked. Something in her expression made Cody step back first, then Tyler, his bravado faltering. Brendan held her gaze for a few seconds longer, but even he stepped back, his confidence cracking slightly. "Whatever," he muttered. "You're not worth it." They walked away, trying to maintain their swagger, but moving quickly enough that it was clear they'd lost that encounter. Riley waited until they were out of sight, then picked up her bag and continued to the office. Her hands weren't shaking. Her heart rate was steady. She'd held her ground, and they'd blinked first. But she knew it wasn't over. That was just round one. Over the following weeks, the dynamic at Oakmont Ridge started shifting in ways that were hard to define, but impossible to miss. Riley continued teaching with the same firm, no-nonsense approach, and her classes began to stabilize. Students who'd been failing started turning in work. Classroom disruptions decreased. It wasn't that everyone suddenly loved her. Plenty of students still found her intimidating or too strict, but they respected the boundaries she'd established. Word spread about the hallway confrontation. In the weird social ecosystem of high school, the fact that she hadn't backed down from Brendan's crew carried weight. Students started seeing her differently. The quiet girl, Emma, asked her for college advice. Jordan submitted a short story he'd written and wanted her feedback. Priya started staying after class to talk about journalism and writing, but Brendan's group wasn't done. They couldn't openly challenge her again without looking weak, so they went underground. Riley's car, she'd started driving again, got keyed in the parking lot. Someone hacked into her school email and sent an inappropriate message to the entire faculty from her account. She found her classroom vandalized one morning, desks overturned and vulgar messages written on the whiteboard. She reported each incident, documented everything, but nothing came of it. Principal Carver gave her the same sympathetic but useless response every time. The school she was beginning to understand was fundamentally broken. The administration had given up on actually maintaining order years ago, settling instead for managing the chaos just enough to avoid lawsuits. But Riley was patient. She'd learned patience in the Marines. You didn't always get to control when or how a confrontation happened. Sometimes you just had to wait for the moment and be ready when it came. Meanwhile, she kept training with Dave at the gym. He pushed her harder now, incorporating scenario-based training, where she had to respond to multiple attackers, verbal threats, ambiguous situations where the right move wasn't clear. "You're not just training your body," he told her. "You're training your decision-making under stress. That's what'll keep you out of trouble." She also started connecting with other teachers who were struggling with similar problems. Mrs. Holloway from across the hall, Mr. Patel who taught history, Ms. Nguyen from the art department. They'd meet for coffee after school sometimes, sharing war stories and strategies. They were all dealing with variations of the same dysfunction, all trying to figure out how to actually teach in an environment designed to prevent teaching. "The problem is, the kids know there are no real consequences," Mr. Patel said during one of these sessions. "The administration doesn't support us. The parents won't support us. So the kids who want to learn get dragged down by the ones who don't, and we're stuck in the middle trying to pretend we have authority we don't actually have." Riley understood, but she was also starting to see things differently. The problem wasn't that there were no consequences. The problem was that the official consequences, detentions, referrals, suspensions, didn't mean anything to kids like Brendan, who'd learned that rules didn't apply to them. What they understood was power, and right now they had all of it. In mid-February, something changed. Brendan's football season was over, which meant he had more time and energy to focus on making life difficult for people. His crew started targeting other students more openly, knocking books out of hands in the hallway, monopolizing cafeteria tables, starting fights in the parking lot after school. The administration issued warnings and handed out pointless detentions, but nothing substantive changed. One afternoon, Riley was walking through the parking lot after school when she saw a commotion near the far corner. A crowd of students had formed a circle, the way they always did when a fight was happening. She started moving toward it, pulling out her phone to call for backup, when she heard a girl screaming. Pushing through the crowd, she found Vanessa Park and two other girls cornering someone against a car. It took Riley a second to recognize the victim. It was Emma, the quiet girl from her third period class. Emma's backpack had been thrown to the ground, its contents scattered across the pavement. Her face was red, tears streaming down her cheeks. Vanessa was holding Emma's phone, waving it around. "Come on, reach for it," Vanessa was taunting. "I know you want it back. Just ask nicely." Riley moved without thinking. She stepped into the circle, putting herself between Vanessa and Emma. "Give me the phone," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Now." Vanessa looked at her with surprise, then defiance. "Mind your business, Ms. Torres. This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does. That's my student and you're on school property. Give me the phone." The crowd had gone silent, everyone watching. Vanessa glanced at her friends, then back at Riley, calculating. She held the phone out, but when Riley reached for it, Vanessa pulled back and threw it, hard, across the parking lot. It skittered across the pavement and disappeared under a car. "Oops," Vanessa said with a smirk. "Butterfingers." Riley felt the cold clarity descending again, the combat mindset she'd been trying to keep in check. She wanted to grab Vanessa, wanted to show her what happened when you acted like the world owed you something. But she held herself back barely. She turned to Emma instead. "Go inside," she said gently. "Get your things and wait in my classroom. I'll help you find your phone in a minute." Emma nodded, gathering her scattered belongings with shaking hands. Riley waited until she was gone, then turned back to Vanessa and the crowd. "Everyone clear out. Now!" Most students started dispersing immediately, sensing that something was about to go down. But Vanessa held her ground, surrounded by her two friends. "You can't tell us what to do out here. School's over. You're on school property until you leave the parking lot," Riley said, "and you just committed theft and destruction of property. So either you leave now, or I call the police and you can explain yourself to them." She pulled out her phone, not bluffing. Vanessa's confidence faltered. She glanced at her friends, then at Riley, then back at the remaining students who were watching. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her friends following. But Riley could see the anger in her posture, the humiliation at being faced down in front of an audience. That night, Riley got a call from Principal Carver. Vanessa's parents had complained, claiming that Riley had threatened their daughter in the parking lot. They're threatening to file a formal complaint with the district, Carver said, sounding tired. Ms. Torres, I need you to be more careful about how you interact with students. This is the second major incident this year involving you. Riley kept her voice level. I stopped a student from being bullied. I did my job. I understand that's how you see it, Carver said, but the Parks see it differently. They have a lawyer. Please, just try to de-escalate situations rather than confronting students directly. She hung up without saying goodbye. The message was clear. Even when she did the right thing, she'd get blamed for it. The system was designed to protect bullies with resources and punish anyone who pushed back. But something else happened after the parking lot incident. Emma came to her classroom the next morning before school, her eyes still red, but her voice determined. Thank you, she said. Nobody's ever stood up for me like that before. Riley nodded, not sure what to say. You shouldn't have to deal with people like that. I know, Emma said, but everyone's afraid of them, even the teachers. She paused. You're not, though. Over the next few weeks, other students started approaching Riley in similar ways. Not many, just a handful, but it was significant. A sophomore named Luis, who'd been getting his lunch stolen. A senior named Asher, who'd been dealing with harassment from Tyler's crew. A freshman named Miguel, who was terrified to come to school because of threats in the hallway. They didn't ask for help exactly. They just wanted someone to know what was happening, someone who might care. Riley listened to each of them, documented what they told her, and tried to work through official channels. It went nowhere. The administration didn't want to hear about it. The school resource officer, a bored cop who spent most of his time in his office, shrugged it off as normal teenage stuff. The system wasn't designed to protect vulnerable kids. It was designed to avoid lawsuits and maintain the status quo, so Riley started doing things differently. When she saw Luis getting cornered in the cafeteria, she'd position herself nearby, just within sight, a silent presence that made the bullies back off. When Asher was being harassed in the hallway, Riley would happen to walk by at just the right moment, her attention focused and clear. She couldn't stop everything. She was just one person, but she could make it harder for Brendan's crew to operate with impunity. They noticed, of course, and they didn't like it. In early March, the situation escalated dramatically. Riley was doing lunch duty when she noticed Tyler and Cody cornering Miguel, the freshman, near the bathrooms. She started moving toward them, but before she could get there, Miguel shoved Tyler, panic overriding his fear. Tyler's reaction was instant and vicious. He grabbed Miguel by the shirt and slammed him against the wall. Riley covered the distance in seconds, years of training making her movements fluid and fast. She grabbed Tyler's arm, her grip precise and controlled, applying just enough pressure to make him release Miguel without actually hurting him. "Let go," she said quietly. "Now." Tyler jerked away from her, surprised by her speed and strength. "He pushed me first," he said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "I was defending myself." Cody was recording on his phone, of course. Riley kept herself between Tyler and Miguel, her stance balanced and ready. "Miguel, go to the office," she said without taking her eyes off Tyler. "Report what happened. I'll be there in a minute." "You can't just take his side," Tyler said, his face flushing with anger. "You didn't even see what happened." "I saw enough," Riley said, "and you're done here. Walk away." For a moment, she thought he might actually swing at her. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the teenage male ego clashing with the growing awareness that he might be out of his depth. But then Brendan appeared, pushing through the crowd. "What's going on?" he demanded, looking between Tyler and Riley. "Your friend was assaulting another student," Riley said flatly. "It's handled." Brendan stepped closer to her, using his height advantage to try to intimidate her. It didn't work. Riley had faced down insurgents and IEDs. A high school linebacker wasn't even on the scale. "You need to stop harassing my friends," Brendan said, his voice low and threatening. "Every day, you're on us about something. Maybe you should focus on teaching instead of playing security guard." Riley looked up at him without flinching. "Maybe your friends should stop behaving like criminals." The word hung in the air. Students around them went silent. Brendan's face darkened. "Watch yourself, Ms. Torres. You're not as protected as you think." "Neither are you," she said quietly. They stared at each other for a long moment, the tension thick enough that nearby students were backing away. Then Mr. Harrison, the science teacher who'd been on the other side of the cafeteria, finally arrived. "What's happening here?" he asked, looking confused and uncomfortable. "Nothing," Brendan said, his eyes still locked on Riley. "We're done here." He turned and walked away, Tyler and Cody following, but Riley could see the anger radiating off all three of them. She'd crossed a line by calling them criminals in front of witnesses. She'd challenged them directly, publicly, and they couldn't let that stand. That afternoon, Riley found her classroom completely trashed. Every desk overturned, books thrown off shelves, papers scattered everywhere. Someone had spray-painted BITCH across her whiteboard in red. The door had been forced open, the lock was broken, and on her desk they'd left her keys, which she'd thought were safely in her bag. They'd gone through her things. She stood in the doorway, looking at the destruction with a strange sense of calm. This was it, the point of no return. They'd escalated from pranks and harassment to actual property destruction and invasion of her personal space. This couldn't be ignored or minimized. She took photos of everything, then called Principal Carver. He arrived 10 minutes later, looking genuinely shocked for the first time since she'd started at Oakmont Ridge. "My God," he said, surveying the damage. "Who did this?" "You know who did this," Riley said. "Same students who've been terrorizing this school since September. Same students who assaulted me in the cafeteria. Same students who you keep protecting because their parents have money." Carver's expression shifted to defensive. "Ms. Torres, we don't know that—" "Yes, we do," she interrupted. "Everyone knows. The whole school knows. And until you actually do something about it, it's going to keep getting worse." "I'll call the police," Carver said, pulling out his phone. "This is vandalism, criminal mischief. We'll file a report." Riley almost laughed. "And then what?" "The Parks and the Koviches will hire lawyers. The investigation will go nowhere. And I'll still be here, dealing with students who think they can do whatever they want." Carver didn't have an answer for that. The police came, took statements, collected evidence. They said they'd investigate. Riley knew they wouldn't find anything concrete. The cameras in this section of the building had been broken for months. There were no witnesses who'd come forward. But something shifted after that. The other teachers who'd been silently sympathetic started being vocally supportive. Mrs. Holloway organized a staff meeting specifically about security and safety. Mr. Patel started a petition calling for better enforcement of behavioral standards. Ms. Nguyen offered to help Riley clean and restore her classroom, an offer that Riley accepted gratefully. More importantly, the students who'd been quietly suffering under Brendan's reign started talking. Emma wrote an anonymous letter to the school board detailing years of bullying that had gone unchecked. Luis's parents, who'd been afraid to complain before, filed a formal complaint with the district. Other families started coming forward, emboldened by the sense that someone was finally paying attention. The school board scheduled a special meeting to address concerns about school climate and safety at Oakmont Ridge High School. It was set for mid-April, which gave Brendan's crew about 6 weeks to retaliate before there might be actual consequences. They made good use of the time. Riley's car got vandalized again, this time with slashed seats and sugar in the gas tank. Someone filed a fake police report claiming she'd threatened students with violence. Rumors started circulating that she'd been fired from her previous job for inappropriate conduct, completely fabricated, but enough students believed it that she had to address it directly with her classes. Her personal information somehow ended up posted on social media. Her address, phone number, email. She started getting threatening messages at all hours. She didn't break. She'd endured worse in combat zones, but she was tired. The constant vigilance, the knowledge that every day might bring some new attack, the loneliness of fighting a battle that no one else seemed to take seriously. It wore on her in ways that firefights and IEDs never had. At least in the Marines, your enemies were clear and your allies had your back. Here, the lines were blurred and the support was tepid at best. She kept training with Dave, who could see the exhaustion setting in. "You know you can walk away from this," he told her one evening after a particularly brutal workout. "You've proved your point. You don't owe these people anything." "I'm not walking away," Riley said, her jaw set. "I'm not giving them the satisfaction." "That's pride talking," Dave said. "I get it. But sometimes the smart move is to live, to fight another day, find a better battlefield." "This is my battlefield," Riley said, "and I'm done retreating." In late March, Brendan made his final mistake. There was an away basketball game on a Friday night, and Riley had volunteered to chaperone the bus. She'd been doing more of these extra duties lately, partly because she genuinely wanted to support the students who weren't problems, partly because she refused to let Brendan's crew push her into hiding. The game was in a town about 40 minutes away, and the plan was to return by 10 p.m. The game went fine. Oakmont Ridge lost, but not dramatically. Riley spent most of the night in the stands, keeping an eye on the student section, making sure nothing got out of hand. She noticed Brendan and his crew were unusually quiet, sitting near the back, occasionally looking at their phones. It made her uneasy. They were planning something. On the bus ride back, she sat near the front, watching the students file on. Brendan got on last, making a show of being friendly and cooperative. "Good game tonight, Ms. Torres," he said with exaggerated politeness as he passed her seat. "Thanks for coming." She didn't respond, just watched him move to the back with his friends. The bus pulled out, heading through the dark country roads back toward Oakmont Ridge. Students were tired and relatively quiet, most dozing or staring at their phones. About 20 minutes into the drive, Riley heard a commotion from the back of the bus. Shouting, laughing, the driver calling out for everyone to sit down. She stood up to see what was happening and saw Brendan and Tyler in the aisle, wrestling with each other, clearly staged to look like a fight, but too performative to be real. "Sit down!" the bus driver shouted, an older man named Mr. Peterson, who looked terrified of losing control. "Both of you, sit down now!" Riley started moving toward the back, but the aisle was narrow and students were in the way. That's when she realized it was a distraction. While everyone's attention was on the fake fight, Vanessa and Cody were doing something near the emergency exit at the back of the bus. She saw Vanessa pull something from her bag, a phone set up to record. Everything clicked into place in an instant. They were setting her up. Whatever they'd planned, they wanted it on camera. Proof that could be edited and manipulated. She stopped moving, staying in the middle of the bus, letting the driver handle the fake fight. Mr. Peterson eventually got Brendan and Tyler to sit down, threatening to call their parents. The rest of the ride was tense but uneventful. When they arrived back at school, students filed off the bus quickly, eager to get home. Riley stayed until the end, checking to make sure nothing was left behind. She found a phone wedged between seats near the emergency exit, probably planted there to be discovered later as evidence of something. She took it to the main office and logged it in lost and found without comment. The next Monday, Nothing happened. Tuesday, nothing. By Wednesday, Riley started to relax slightly, thinking maybe she dodged whatever they'd planned. Then Thursday, Principal Carver called her into his office. His expression was grim. "Ms. Torres, I need to show you something," he said, turning his computer screen toward her. It was a video, grainy and shaky, clearly taken from a phone. It showed the interior of a bus at night. The timestamp said it was from the Friday game trip. Riley watched herself standing in the aisle, moving toward the back. The video was edited to make it look like she'd shoved a student. The angle was wrong, the context removed, but it was convincing enough if you didn't know what you were looking at. "This was sent anonymously to the school board," Carver said, "along with a complaint that you physically assaulted a student during the trip." Riley stared at the screen, a cold fury building in her chest. "That's not what happened. That video's been edited." "I believe you," Carver said, surprising her. "But we're going to have to investigate. The board is taking this very seriously. Until the investigation is complete, you're going to be placed on administrative leave." "You're suspending me," Riley said flatly. "It's not a suspension," Carver said quickly. "It's paid leave pending investigation. Standard procedure when there's an accusation of physical contact with a student." "But Brendan Kovich actually assaulted me in front of hundreds of witnesses, and he never faced any consequences," Riley said. "I'm being punished based on a doctored video, and he's still here." Carver looked genuinely pained. "I know how this looks. But my hands are tied. The complaint went straight to the board. They're demanding action." Riley gathered her things from her classroom that afternoon while students were still in class. She couldn't face them, couldn't explain what was happening. A few teachers stopped by, Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Patel, Ms. Nguyen, offering support and outrage, but it didn't change anything. By the end of the day, she was officially on leave, banned from campus pending the outcome of the investigation. At home, Riley sat in her dark apartment and tried to process what had happened. She'd been outmaneuvered. Despite all her training, all her experience, all her attempts to handle this the right way, they'd still won. They'd used the system against her, weaponized policies meant to protect students to attack a teacher who'd tried to protect students. It was brilliant in a sociopathic way. She could fight it, of course. Get a lawyer, demand to see the original unedited video, force a real investigation. But that would take months, and even if she won, even if she was vindicated, the damage would be done. Her reputation would be destroyed. Other schools wouldn't hire her. She'd be the teacher who'd been investigated for assaulting students, and the details wouldn't matter. Or she could walk away, accept defeat, find another career. Teaching clearly wasn't working out, but then she thought about Emma, about Luis and Asha and Miguel and all the other students who'd trusted her. She thought about what would happen to them if she left, if Brendan's crew faced no consequences and learned they could do whatever they wanted without accountability. She thought about the message it would send, that bullies always win if they have enough resources and are willing to be cruel enough. And she thought about something Sergeant Ramirez had told her during basic training after Riley had gotten knocked down hard during a particularly brutal sparring session. "The fight's not over when you hit the ground," Ramirez had said, standing over her. "The fight's over when you stop getting up." Riley Torres started getting up. She called a lawyer the next morning, a woman named Janet Krause who specialized in education law. She explained the situation, all of it, from the cafeteria assault to the parking lot vandalism to the edited video. Krause listened without interrupting, taking notes. "You have a solid case," Krause said when Riley finished. "Multiple witnesses to assault, documented harassment, evidence of a conspiracy to manufacture false accusations against you. But I need you to understand, taking this to court is going to be ugly. The district will fight hard. The parents will throw money at their own lawyers. This could drag on for years." "I don't care," Riley said. "I'm tired of running." Okay, Krauss said. Then let's fight. They filed a lawsuit against the school district, naming Principal Carver, the school board, and the parents of Brendan, Tyler, Cody, and Vanessa as defendants. The allegations included hostile work environment, failure to address documented harassment, retaliation for reporting misconduct, and conspiracy to manufacture false evidence. Krauss also contacted the local news, tipping them off to the story. The response was immediate and explosive. The local paper ran a front-page article about a teacher suing Oakmont Ridge High School, interviewing parents and students about conditions at the school. The story gained traction on social media. A former student started a thread detailing years of bullying she'd endured at Oakmont Ridge, with no administrative support. Other alumni joined in. Current students began posting their own stories anonymously. Within a week, the school had a full-blown PR crisis on its hands. The school board called an emergency meeting, this time open to the public. The auditorium was packed. Parents, students, teachers, community members, reporters. Riley sat in the audience with Janet Krauss, watching as the board tried to respond to the mounting pressure. Principal Carver looked like he hadn't slept in days. The superintendent, a slick corporate type named Dr. Harmon, tried to control the narrative, talking about investigations and due process and the district's commitment to safety. Then the public comment period opened. Emma was the first to speak. She walked to the microphone, her hands shaking but her voice steady, and read a prepared statement about the years of bullying she'd endured and the single teacher who'd finally stood up for her. Luis spoke next, his parents standing behind him for support. Then Asha, then Miguel, then a dozen other students, one after another, detailing a pattern of harassment and administrative indifference that had been going on for years. Parents spoke too, frustrated, angry, demanding to know why the board had allowed this to continue. Teachers spoke, including Mrs. Holloway and Mr. Patel, confirming that they'd been reporting problems for years and been ignored. By the time the comment period ended 3 hours later, the board looked shell-shocked. The meeting ended with a vague promise to thoroughly investigate all allegations and take appropriate action, but the damage was done. The story had gone regional now, picked up by newspapers in Pittsburgh and beyond. Suburban school district accused of enabling bullies, read one headline. Teacher sues after years of harassment, read another. Behind the scenes, things moved quickly. The district's lawyers, realizing they had a losing case, started pushing for settlement. Brendan's parents, faced with potential civil liability, suddenly became very interested in discipline for their son. The school board, desperate to contain the PR disaster, announced sweeping policy changes and the hiring of outside consultants to review school climate. And crucially, a forensic analysis of the video allegedly showing Riley assaulting a student revealed what she'd known all along. It was edited. The metadata showed multiple cuts, and the original footage, recovered from Vanessa's cloud backup, clearly showed Riley responding appropriately to the staged fight. The students who'd created the false evidence faced potential criminal charges for filing a false report and evidence tampering. 3 weeks after Riley had been placed on leave, Principal Carver called her. "The board has completed its investigation," he said, his voice formal and strained. "The allegations against you have been determined to be unfounded. You're welcome to return to work immediately, and the district is prepared to offer a formal apology and compensatory damages for the administrative leave." "I'll return to work," Riley said. "The other stuff can wait until my lawyer works out the details." When she walked back into Oakmont Ridge High School on a Monday morning in mid-May, everything felt different. The story had changed her from an unknown new teacher into a symbol of something larger. Students she'd never met knew who she was. Teachers greeted her warmly in the hallways. Even Principal Carver seemed almost deferential. But the real change was in Brendan and his crew. They were still at school. The criminal charges were being handled through juvenile court, and that process would take months, but they were subdued, quiet. They avoided Riley in the hallways, kept their heads down in class. The shield of parental protection had cracked, and they knew it. The school board meeting about discipline policy was scheduled for late May, the final confrontation that would determine not just their fates, but the future of Oakmont Ridge. Riley planned to be there. The night before the meeting, she went to Dave's gym for what had become her routine evening workout. They did light sparring, then some bag work, then stretching. As they were cooling down, Dave said, "So, you won. How's it feel?" Riley thought about it. "Not like I expected," she said honestly. "I thought I'd feel vindicated or satisfied or something. Mostly I just feel tired." "That's because real fights aren't like the movies," Dave said. "There's no triumphant music, no slow-motion victory moment. You just survive, deal with the aftermath, and move on." "Is that what I'm doing?" Riley asked. "Surviving?" "No," Dave said. "You're doing more than that. You're standing up. That's different, harder but different." The school board meeting was packed even fuller than the previous one. The agenda included a vote on new disciplinary policies, recommendations for administrative changes, and discussion of the recent events that had brought national attention to Oakmont Ridge. Riley sat in the front row with Janet Krause, Emma, Luis, and several other students who'd been directly affected. The board members looked uncomfortable as they outlined the proposed changes: mandatory reporting of harassment, independent investigations of student complaints, a zero-tolerance policy for violence and intimidation, funding for additional counselors, and security. It was a complete overhaul of the existing system, a tacit admission that everything before had been inadequate. Then came the disciplinary hearings for Brendan Kovich, Tyler Rennick, Cody Walsh, and Vanessa Park. Each student and their parents sat before the board while the charges were read: assault, harassment, vandalism, conspiracy to file false reports. The evidence was overwhelming. Video footage, witness statements, forensic analysis, everything carefully documented. The parents tried to defend their children. Brendan's father talked about football scholarships and one mistake ruining a promising future. Tyler's mother cried and blamed the school for not providing enough structure. Vanessa's parents threatened more lawsuits, but the board, under intense public scrutiny and facing potential legal liability, didn't bend. All 4 students were expelled, effective immediately. They'd be allowed to finish their coursework remotely and receive diplomas, but they were banned from campus and all school activities. In addition, they'd face criminal charges in juvenile court for the most serious incidents. The decision sent shockwaves through the auditorium. Some parents applauded, others looked horrified. Students whispered among themselves, processing what had just happened. Brendan and his parents walked out without comment, but Riley caught his expression as he passed her row. It wasn't angry or defiant. It was shocked, disbelieving, like he'd genuinely never considered that there could be real consequences for his actions. After the meeting, reporters swarmed Riley for comment. She kept her statement brief. "I hope this sends a message that everyone in a school community, students, teachers, administrators, deserves to be treated with basic dignity and respect. No one should have to endure harassment or abuse, and no one should be above accountability." The next day at school, the atmosphere was electric. Students clustered in hallways, talking in excited or hushed tones depending on their perspective. Some celebrated the expulsions, feeling like justice had finally been served. Others worried about the precedent, afraid that stricter discipline would target them next. Teachers seemed energized, hopeful that maybe things could actually change. Riley's classes were different. Students paid attention, not out of fear, but out of genuine respect. They'd seen her fight for them, seen her stand up when it would have been easier to walk away. Emma started a creative writing club and asked Riley to be the faculty advisor. Jordan submitted a short story to a national competition and credited Riley with encouraging him to share his work. Priya wrote an article for the school paper about the importance of teachers who refuse to accept injustice. But Riley was most affected by something smaller. A week after the board meeting, she found a note slipped under her classroom door. It was from a freshman she'd never taught, didn't even recognize the name. The note said simply, "Thank you for making this place safer. I don't dread coming to school anymore." That note, more than any of the public recognition or legal victories, made Riley understand what she'd actually accomplished. She hadn't just won a personal battle, she'd changed something fundamental about the school's culture. She'd shown students that they didn't have to accept abuse as normal, that there were adults who would stand with them, that bullies could be held accountable. The semester ended with a strange mixture of exhaustion and hope. Oakmont Ridge had a long way to go. Institutional dysfunction didn't disappear overnight, but there was momentum for change. The new disciplinary policies were being implemented. A new principal was hired after Carver resigned under pressure. Additional counselors and support staff were brought in. The school board committed to annual climate surveys and independent oversight. Riley was offered a permanent contract for the following year, with an apology and compensation for everything she'd endured. She signed it without hesitation. She wasn't done at Oakmont Ridge yet. Over the summer, she took a few weeks off to actually rest, something she hadn't done in years. She visited family, read for pleasure, took long runs without thinking about training or threats. She met with Dr. Yates regularly, processing the trauma of the past year. She started sleeping better, the hypervigilance that had defined her first months at the school finally beginning to ease. But she also prepared for the next year. She worked with the new administration to develop a mentoring program for at-risk students. She organized professional development workshops for teachers on trauma-informed instruction and restorative justice practices. She connected with community organizations that could provide additional support for students dealing with violence or harassment. When school started again in August, Riley Torres walked into Oakmont Ridge High School as a different kind of teacher. She was no longer the quiet, underestimated new hire. She was a known quantity, tough, fair, someone who wouldn't tolerate injustice, but also wouldn't abuse her authority. Students tested boundaries early, as students always do, but they backed off when they hit her limits. She'd earned their respect the hard way. Her second year was easier in many ways. She knew the students, knew the culture, knew how to navigate the system. Her classes were some of the most popular in the school, not because she'd become soft or entertaining, but because students knew she actually cared about them learning. She pushed them hard, expected excellence, but also supported them when they struggled. Emma graduated that year and was accepted to a competitive journalism program. Before she left, she came to Riley's classroom one last time. "I wouldn't have applied if you hadn't been here," she said. "I would have just accepted that this was all I deserved. You showed me that wasn't true." Riley didn't know what to say to that. She'd just been doing her job, being the teacher she wished she'd had. But Emma's words stayed with her, a reminder of why all of it, the harassment, the fights, the legal battles, had been worth it. On the last day of school, Riley stood in her classroom after all the students had left, looking around at the space she'd fought so hard to keep. The room was organized, but lived in now, filled with student artwork and writing samples and remnants of a year's worth of learning. Through the window she could see the parking lot, students celebrating the start of summer, shouting and laughing in the warm afternoon sun. She thought about where she'd been a year and a half ago, isolated, targeted, uncertain whether she'd even make it through the semester. She thought about all the moments when walking away would have been easier, when the pressure had seemed unbearable. She thought about Sergeant Ramirez's words about getting back up. The fight wasn't over. There would always be new challenges, new students who needed support, new injustices to confront. But Riley Torres had learned something crucial during her time at Oakmont Ridge. Real strength wasn't about physical capabilities or tactical training. It was about moral courage. It was about standing up even when you were afraid, even when the system was rigged against you, even when no one else would stand with you. She'd learned that sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones you win quickly or dramatically. They're the ones you win by refusing to surrender, by showing up every day, by maintaining your principles when everything and everyone is pushing you to compromise them. She'd learned that heroism doesn't always look like a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it looks like a teacher who won't give up on her students, who won't accept cruelty as normal, who insists that everyone, even the most vulnerable, deserves dignity and respect. And she'd learned that transformation works both ways. She'd come to Oakmont Ridge hoping to transform students through education. Instead, they'd transformed her. They'd reminded her why she'd left the military, because she believed people could change, could grow, could become better than they were. The students who'd stood with her, who'd found their own courage to speak up, had proven that belief wasn't naive idealism, it was truth. As Riley locked her classroom and headed out to the parking lot, she passed several students who called out farewells and promises to see her next year. She waved back, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the desperate, striving hope of someone trying to survive. The quiet, steady hope of someone who knows exactly where they belong and what they're meant to do. She walked to the bus stop, her bag full of papers to grade over the summer, her mind already planning curriculum for the fall. The evening sun was warm on her face. The street was busy with end-of-school traffic, parents picking up kids, teenagers heading to jobs or friends' houses. The whole neighborhood alive with the energy of young people suddenly free. Riley Torres had been through combat zones, through humiliation and harassment, through legal battles and public scrutiny. She'd been knocked down, gotten back up and kept fighting. And now, standing at a bus stop in a struggling suburb outside Pittsburgh, waiting to go home to her small apartment and her quiet life, she felt something she hadn't felt since before she'd enlisted in the Marines all those years ago. She felt at peace. The bus arrived. She got on, found a seat near the window and watched the world pass by. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, everything continuing on as it always had and always would. But Riley knew that beneath that ordinary surface, small battles were being fought every day. Students standing up to bullies, teachers refusing to accept dysfunction, communities demanding better for their children. And sometimes, when the conditions were right and someone was brave enough to fight back, those small battles turned into something larger. Not a revolution exactly, but a transformation, a shift in what was considered acceptable, a reminder that systems only worked because people made them work. And when enough people refused to accept the status quo, change became inevitable. Riley had been part of that change at Oakmont Ridge. She'd been the catalyst, the spark that lit a fire others could gather around. And now, as the bus carried her away from the school and toward home, she allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. She'd done what she'd set out to do. She'd survived. She'd stood up. She'd made a difference. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be students who struggled, who needed support, who tested boundaries. There would be institutional inertia to overcome, policies to change, battles to fight. But tonight, Riley Torres could rest, knowing she'd earned her place in that school and in that community. She wasn't the underestimated new teacher anymore. She was simply a teacher, scarred, experienced, unbreakable. And that was enough.